Hello, my minions, and welcome back to the course of U.S. history. I am your host, Mr. Samuelson. Last time we were together, we looked at the Pilgrims in Plymouth, those religious separatists who traveled the world to create religious freedom for themselves, and only themselves. Today, we're going to look at the wider settling of New England. We'll spend some time looking at Massachusetts Bay, Rhode Island, Connecticut, and a moment on New Hampshire. Let's start with Massachusetts. Now, the Pilgrims, those in Plymouth, were this small fraction of the larger Puritan group. Remember, they were the separatists, the ones that just couldn't stand being in England one moment longer. They had to go. But there was this larger group of Puritans that also eventually decided to leave England. From 1630 to 1650, there was a period known as the Great Migration. 40,000 Puritans left England, and about 17,000 of those made their way to Massachusetts in this Great Migration. Now, these Puritans were led by John Winthrop, and they were going to settle the Massachusetts Bay Colony. Now, this Massachusetts Bay Colony, right here, was chartered for them, and it granted them the land north of the Plymouth Colony. So here's Plymouth, down here, and this is where the Pilgrims were. Up here's the Massachusetts Bay Colony, where a larger Puritan group is going. Now, they will eventually combine and form Massachusetts as a state, but we're not going to worry about that. Right now, we're going to be talking about Massachusetts Bay. Now, Winthrop wanted this colony to be the model of Puritan life, Puritan ethics, Puritan religion. Everything is going to be Puritan. It was going to be a positive example to the world, a city on a hill. Coincidentally, it also wound up being a city on a hill. Now, by 1640, Boston was a growing, thriving city with 16,000 people in it. Now, by today's standards, 16,000 is nothing, but in 1640, 16,000 was a substantial city. And in the colonies, it has the largest population by far. It is a major colonial city, and it got there in 20 years. It's pretty impressive. Now, the colony itself was governed by a group called the General Court. The General Court makes all the laws that govern the colony. Now, these laws are reflected in Puritan religious beliefs. Puritan religious laws were the colonial laws of Massachusetts, and they enforced this religion. You had to be a Puritan, you had to follow Puritan work ethic to live in Massachusetts. There was no other exception. All residents, even if you weren't a Puritan, you had to act like you were a Puritan. And that included attending Puritan religious services. So if you're not a Puritan, just make sure that nobody knows that you're not a Puritan. You have to act in all ways like you are. Now, some did not live well within this system. And the Puritans did not tolerate these people. They basically had two rules here. You are either a Puritan or you've got to leave. That third option, which did come into effect for a few people, well, that kind of meant that you died. Hangings were not incredibly uncommon for those who did not convert or leave. The Quakers, in particular, a religious group, had some problems with this in Massachusetts. Certainly, they tried not to hang too many people because, that's not a good way to encourage people to come to your colony. But amongst people who just wouldn't leave and just wouldn't convert, well, several were hanged. Now, Roger Williams was a Puritan. He was a Puritan preacher, but he did not believe that this interpretation of Puritanism was the right way to go. He thought that the church was way too strong and that Puritans, they can have their religion, but the government should really act separately. He believed in something called the separation of church and state. That you have your government and you have your religion, and that they should not be one and the same. So Williams preaches this belief, and in return is banned from Massachusetts. He doesn't get hanged because, he's a Puritan and all, but he does get banned from Massachusetts in 1635, and he leaves. He goes to the south, and he spends his winter with the Narragansett Indians. With the Narragansett Indians, he and his followers are eventually going to purchase a chunk of Narragansett land. And here they create the settlement of Providence, Rhode Island. And I don't have it marked here, but one of his central beliefs here, coming from Massachusetts, where church and state were so strong, was in complete religious freedom. So Rhode Island will be a colony that believes in religious freedom. It will actually be the site of the first Jewish synagogue in North America, and it is still there in Rhode Island today, although not in Providence. Williams makes this all official in 1644 when he receives a charter for the colony of Rhode Island. And if you are interested where that synagogue is, it's down in Newport, the city right here. All right, Connecticut. Connecticut has a little bit of a different story. Connecticut was first settled by Thomas Hooker and his followers. They're going to leave Massachusetts largely because all the best farmland in Massachusetts has already been taken. He and his men just can't find enough of it. Massachusetts, when you get into western Massachusetts, is pretty rocky. So they go off in search of other land that they can settle. They wind up settling in Hartford, Connecticut, and there they write the first constitution in the New World, the Fundamental Orders of Connecticut. And according to this, all men who owned land could vote, regardless of their religion. Now, this eventually becomes all white men. They didn't have that problem initially. And then it was also all white men above the age of 21. And you also had to have property, and you had to have a fair amount of it. So, okay, so not all that democratic, but, better than one person in charge, I suppose. New Hampshire and Maine. They don't really matter all that much. We don't even know who the first settlers were. They're probably fur trappers or traders that wandered up into that territory, met some Indians, got some furs. New Hampshire becomes a colony eventually, a little bit later on, 1680, so quite a bit after the others. But it does become its own colony. Maine, however, Maine is a part of Massachusetts. And it's a part of Massachusetts for a long time, all the way up to 1820. So we're going to revisit this a couple of units down the road. But we look geographically, we have Massachusetts here, Maine up there. They're not contiguous. They're not connected. New Hampshire kind of gets in the way. But Maine is going to be a part of Massachusetts for quite some time, for about 200 years. So let's not think about colonial Maine. All right, Native American relations. The Great Migration, all those Puritans coming over, and then they all spread out over the land. This is going to cause some problems because those colonial settlements are taking up all of the best farmland. Thomas Hooker had moved out of Massachusetts because all the good farmland was gone. And all the while, Native Americans are getting pushed off of it. Now, the first significant conflict is going to be when the Pequot tribe is going to raid those Connecticut settlements. They're going to attack those people in Connecticut who are taking all of the best farmland. Now, the colonial response to this is vicious and it is violent. It is a massacre that borders on genocide. This is one Pequot town, the town of Mystic, which is surrounded by colonists who then go in and burn houses that have women and children hiding in them. It's really just an absolute massacre. They wipe out a significant portion of the Pequot tribe in raids like that. That was the lesser of the two big conflicts. The big one was King Philip's War. This was a large war, and this was an all-out war for survival. The Wampanoag, the same guys that had taught the Pilgrims how to grow food, had decided that the English in Rhode Island and Massachusetts were a major threat, a threat to their very existence. And so Chief Metacomet, the English called King Philip, gathered together all of his allies, united all the tribes of the region, and said, we've got to get rid of these English. This is a fight for our very survival. We need to destroy them all. We need to push them back to the sea. And so they wage all-out war. Now, this is one of the bloodiest wars in U.S. history if you look at the percentage of the population that died. In absolute numbers, it can't compare to World War II or the Civil War. But in terms of the percentage of the population, it's the bloodiest war in U.S. history. It is 3 years of absolute violent, total warfare, but Metacomet is eventually killed in one of those conflicts. His alliance breaks apart without him, and the tribes of the Northeast, the tribes of New England, fall apart and can no longer stand against English settlement. Well, that was the settlement of New England. Next time, we're going to look at the settlement of the Middle Colonies. Here, we're going to look at the English takeover of New Netherlands and the creation of New York, New Jersey, Pennsylvania, and Delaware. I hope you enjoyed this lesson. I'll see you next time. Farewell.